Hello there, I'm Clyde. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow, sleepy stories about nothing in particular, well, you've come to the right place. I've wandered through history, across time and continents, simply observing quiet moments no one else thought to record. You'll find all of these thoroughly uneventful adventures in my Boring Adventures playlist. Feel free to check it out after this one, unless you drift off before then. And if you haven't already, now would be the perfect time to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't forget later when you're too relaxed to care. I post these soft little time travels twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, and they're all equally slow. Oh, and if you decide to become a channel member, not only would you be helping support what I do here, but I'll create a personalized sleepy story just for you. Me, Clyde, whispering your very own boring journey. Doesn't get more soothing than that. Now then, the stone in my pocket was beginning to hum again. It's a smooth thing, just the size of my palm. I've carried it with me for as long as I can remember. Every now and then, it glows faintly, like a sleepy firefly, and hums a little tune only I can feel. That's how I know it's time to go. I was leaning against the same tree as always. I suppose it must exist outside of time because it's always there, in the same place, no matter where or when I go. Bark like polished driftwood. Roots like lazy fingers curling through the soil. I don't know if it's real or just part of the in-between. Anyway, I looked down at the stone and gave it a small nod. "All right then," I murmured. "Let's see what kind of nothingness we can find today." The hum deepened and a soft warmth spread through my fingers. Then a blink, a heartbeat, and the tree was gone. I was standing beside a weathered stone wall, slick with moss, under a sky the color of damp wool, which turned out to be a fitting metaphor. The air smelled like lanolin and peat smoke, with a faint whisper of heather on the wind. I took a slow step forward. A low hill rose up to my right, topped with tufts of scrubby green. Beyond that, rooftops clustered together like hens settling in for the evening. The buildings were small, thick-walled, with thatched roofs and crooked chimneys. A faint clatter of hooves echoed somewhere off in the distance, though I didn't see any horses. It was quiet. Not silent, there was always some sound in history, but quiet in the way damp days tend to be. The kind of quiet that wraps around your ears like a blanket that's still warm from the sun. I took another step. My boots sank slightly into the muddy path, and I found myself beside a long wooden rack strung with wool. Hundreds of hanks of it, pale ivory to earthy beige, all twisting slightly in the breeze, still damp from the dyeing process, or maybe just the weather. I tilted my head and squinted. Some of the hanks had a faint pinkish tint. Others looked more green than gray, as if they'd been steeped in nettles or yarrow. A few had an almost bluish tone, subtle and shy. There was a rhythm to the way they swayed, back and forth. Just enough to make a sleepy sort of dance, like tired laundry day dreams. I leaned against the post and watched. I must have stood there for quite a while. No one seemed to mind. A boy wandered past with a bundle of peat, barely noticing me. A woman in a cloak the color of barley glanced over and gave me a small nod, as if to say, "Yes, the wool's nearly dry now. You picked a fine time to arrive." I nodded back. The wind shifted slightly, and I caught another whiff of lanolin, a gentle, sheepy smell, clean in its own way, honest. Behind the wool rack, a tiny path led toward the village proper. I could just make out the crooked eaves of a weaving shed and the low hum of a loom at work, but I wasn't quite ready to leave this spot. The wool was still damp after all, and besides, there was something comforting about the repetition, the way the wool danced, the rhythm of the wind, the soft hush of old things going about their business. I glanced down at the stone in my hand. It was quiet again. Just a stone. So I leaned back against the post and watched a little longer. No need to rush. I eventually wandered. It wasn't planned. I just sort of drifted. One moment I was leaning against the post, admiring the wool's commitment to drying in the least enthusiastic way possible, and the next I was trailing a few steps down the path toward the rest of the village. The ground was a bit uneven, as if the stones under the mud were trying to remember where they used to be. I walked slowly, letting the soft squish of my boots settle into the rhythm of the place. To my left was a small bench beneath an ash tree. I say bench, but it was really just a thick slab of timber with two stumpy legs, green with lichen and damp in all the wrong places. Naturally, I sat down anyway. There was a spoon beside me, a wooden one, smooth, curved, with the handle worn down on one side. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. "Well now," I whispered, "who left you here?" The spoon didn't answer, just nestled itself into my palm like it had been waiting for me, which would have been a much more interesting development if I weren't me, Clyde, collector of mild observations and professional avoider of plot. I leaned back on the bench. It creaked, a faint bar carried on the breeze. I turned my head and spotted a sheep not too far off, standing remarkably still like a very round statue with hooves. It blinked at me. I blinked back. That was the end of our exchange. Behind it, a small paddock held a few more woolly companions, most of whom were busy doing absolutely nothing, which I admired. "You're doing fine work," I murmured. A woman with a faded headscarf walked past me, carrying a basket of something vaguely turnip-shaped. She didn't stop, but she did glance down at the spoon in my hand. "That John's?" I shrugged slightly. She gave a soft grunt of acknowledgement and continued on. I looked down at the spoon again. "So you're John's, are you?" It still didn't say anything. After a while, I stood up. Not out of any particular need, just because the bench was getting wetter the longer I sat on it. I placed the spoon carefully on the bench again, where it wobbled once before settling back into its original position. A very dedicated spoon. The path ahead led to a little stone bridge, just a few steps long, really, more of a polite hump in the road than a proper crossing, but underneath it trickled a stream, shallow and clear, weaving around smooth stones and tufts of grass like it had all the time in the world. I paused in the middle of the bridge and looked down. A leaf floated by, then another. I watched them until they were gone. The breeze tugged at my cloak. I reached into my pocket and ran my fingers along the smooth curve of my stone. Still quiet, still warm, still waiting. I leaned on the bridge rail and let out a breath that didn't need to be sighed, but chose to be anyway. Across the way, someone was stirring something in a cauldron. I could hear the wooden spoon scraping gently against the sides. Not John's spoon, I assumed. This one looked more like a stirring kind. Deeper, maybe. Or maybe it just had a better sense of purpose. The sky hadn't changed much. Still that damp wool gray with the occasional hint of brightness behind it. Not quite sun, but not quite cloud either. Just presence. I stepped off the bridge. There was a chicken. It didn't seem to be in any particular hurry, so I waited for it to cross the road, which it did. Eventually, I didn't ask why. The chicken had disappeared by the time I made it past the last cottage on the lane. Not vanished dramatically, just no longer visible. Probably off scratching at something vital and mysterious, like a loose pebble or a very serious bug. I followed the curve of the path toward a squat little building with a sign above the door that looked vaguely like a spindle, or maybe a carrot. Hard to tell, really. It was made of wood and hung on a crooked bit of iron that squeaked every time the wind nudged it. The door was open just enough to be friendly, but not so wide as to be presumptuous. I knocked gently anyway. No answer. So I poked my head inside and said the only greeting that ever really fits these sorts of moments. "Hello?" From somewhere in the back, a voice responded. Not urgently, but with the sort of lazy welcome that suggests the speaker has been sitting for a while and doesn't plan to stop just yet. "You can come in, long as you don't touch the blue." I stepped inside and instinctively looked for anything blue. There was quite a bit of it. Hanks of wool in every possible stage of transformation hung from beams and hooks and wooden dowels. Some were still damp and smelling faintly of nettle tea. Others had been spun into loose skeins and wound into bundles the size of small cabbages. Some were bright robin's egg or cornflower. Others more like dusk or ink in a very shallow puddle. I didn't touch any of it. A man sat behind a loom near the back, his feet bare, one elbow propped up on the edge of a bench. He had the look of someone who had always been weaving and couldn't remember a time before. He didn't look up. "That your sheep out front?" he asked. "No," I said. "Just visiting." He nodded once, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. He resumed his work, guiding the shuttle back and forth with the calm of a man who had long since made peace with repetition. The clack of the loom was soft and steady, like rain on a roof that isn't leaking yet. I found a stool and sat down. The man didn't seem to mind. After a while, I asked, "What happens if you do touch the blue?" He paused only long enough to blink. "Then you're responsible for it," he said. "Fair enough." A pot on the far side of the room gave off faint steam. Not boiling, not bubbling, just steaming in that quiet, occupied way pots sometimes do. I didn't ask what was in it. Some mysteries are best left mildly ignored. There was a small window near the ceiling, and through it I could just make out a sliver of the sky. Still grey, still wool-colored, still perfectly adequate. I stayed a long time. The loom continued to clack, and in that slow, soothing rhythm I began to wonder what the rest of the village was doing. Probably the same things they always did. Tending, drying, spinning, chopping. Nothing loud, nothing rushed. Just things. Eventually I stood. The man nodded again, still not looking. "Thanks," I said. "Mind the blue," he replied. I left the door as I'd found it, open just enough. Outside the weaver's shop, the village had settled into an even quieter sort of hum. A few children skipped stones near the stream. Their laughter was soft and sporadic, like the breeze had to carry it part way before it reached me. One of them paused to tie a shoe that didn't have laces. I admired the commitment to form. I wandered down a narrow side path lined with low stone walls. A few hens picked their way through tufts of grass, occasionally stopping to look important. There was a house near the edge of the path with a pot bubbling outside. A woman in a thick brown apron stood over it, stirring with the kind of spoon that looked more like an oar. She didn't seem in a rush. The steam rose like a story she wasn't quite finished telling yet. She didn't look up when I approached, but she did say, "If you're here for the soup, you'll need to bring your own bowl." I reached into my coat pocket out of sheer reflex and found, unsurprisingly, no bowl. Just the stone. Still warm, still silent. "No bowl," I said. "Just visiting." She nodded. "Well then, you'll get the scent for free." That seemed fair. The pot gave off a mixture of smells, root vegetables maybe. Something green, possibly sage, possibly not. Definitely water. Could have been onions, or just wishful thinking. She reached down and tossed in a handful of something that looked like shredded bark. I didn't ask. "Soup?" I ventured. "That's what we call it," she replied. "Some days it leans more stew, other days more tea." I looked into the pot. It was the color of secrets. She finally turned to glance at me, eyeing my cloak, then my boots, then my eyes. You're not from around here, are you? No, I said. I drift. She gave a thoughtful little grunt. You'll want to keep your feet warm tonight. Damp's coming in. I nodded, though I had no clear plans to sleep anywhere in particular. As I turned to leave, she added, if you find an extra bowl along the way, bring it back. We'll put something in it for you. That seemed like a good enough arrangement. I wandered on. The sky had shifted again, still gray, but now with a touch of lavender along the horizon. Maybe the day was finally thinking about settling down, or maybe it was just stretching. A boy ran past me chasing a hoop with a stick. The hoop, I should note, was winning. Around the bend, I found a small bench made from a wagon wheel and 2 milk crates. It was dry. I took it as a sign. I sat. From here I could see the edge of the wool racks again. They hadn't changed much. Still hanging. Still dampish. Still completely uninterested in the passage of time. I smiled to myself and ran my fingers once again over the stone in my pocket. It pulsed softly, like a sleeping heartbeat, patient and present. I closed my eyes, just for a moment. I didn't mean to end up near the sheep again. It just sort of happened. One minute I was admiring the cleverness of a rock wall that had clearly been built by someone with strong opinions about rocks and right angles, and the next there was a loud bar followed by a very small, very urgent mare, and I was surrounded. Well, 3 of them. That counts as surrounded in sheep terms. The large one I'd seen earlier gave me a meaningful look and took 2 bold steps forward. I took 1 backward in return, which seemed to satisfy whatever social protocol governed these things. The smallest sheep, barely more than a fuzzball on legs, was attempting to climb a slope that was, objectively, not designed for climbing. It made it about halfway, slipped slightly, then stood very still as if hoping no one had noticed. I noticed. The other adult sheep seemed unimpressed. I gave the small one a sympathetic nod. The slope in question led to a narrow trail between the outer buildings and the ridge that backed the village. A low stone arch marked the start of it, half covered in moss and something purporting to be ivy, but probably just an enthusiastic weed. I followed the path. The sheep made no effort to follow. They were apparently done with me. The trail narrowed into a sort of ledge walk, not dangerous, but definitely the sort of thing that might be called a shortcut by someone who didn't want you to enjoy yourself. At the top was a single wooden bench. Of course there was. I sat because that's what benches are for, and because standing seemed unnecessary. From here, the view stretched out over the rooftops. You could see the steam from the soup pot rising like a lazy ghost, the movement of villagers like gentle clockwork, and the wool still drying, like pale flags of patience in the breeze. I could also see the sea, just a sliver of it tucked between the hills, gray and shimmering and entirely unimpressed by anything that might be happening inland. It looked cold, not unfriendly, just brisk. I pulled my cloak a little tighter around my shoulders. A beetle wandered across the bench beside me, paused, then kept going. It had a destination in mind. I did not. I stayed like that for a long while, not quite thinking, not quite napping. There's a kind of quiet that only happens when the wind is just enough to notice and the sun isn't bothering to show off. A polite quiet, the kind that doesn't expect anything from you. I liked it very much. Eventually, my stomach gave a small, diplomatic growl. I took that as a cue to start heading back. Slowly. Halfway down the trail, I passed the fuzzball sheep again. It had made it farther up the slope this time and was frozen in place with the air of someone pretending to be a rock. "You're doing fine," I whispered. It blinked. Or possibly it was a twitch. Either way, we had an understanding. I stepped carefully over a few stubborn roots, avoided a puddle that looked like it wanted trouble, and returned to the village proper. The soup lady was gone. The pot remained. Still steaming. Still secrets. The sun, if you could call it that, was now a faint blur behind the clouds. Not quite setting, but definitely moving toward the idea of ending the day. The village had taken on that lovely, hushed tone that happens just before supper when things slow down but haven't quite stopped. I found myself back near the center of things, if there even was a center. A crossroads of sorts, though both roads looked more like paths, and neither one seemed especially committed to going anywhere. A wooden sign hung on a post there. It had 2 arrows, each pointing in a vaguely contradictory direction. One said river, the other said river. I took this as a sign that I could not make a wrong choice. Beside the post was a barrel. Unlabeled. Ordinary. Naturally, I had to look inside. Buttons. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Big ones. Tiny ones. Wooden ones with 1 hole. Brass ones with 4. Some carved, some cracked. Some that looked like they'd been rescued from another century altogether. I stared at them for a while. Eventually, a voice behind me said, "You can take one if you need it." I turned to find an elderly woman with a shawl made entirely of patchwork squares. Each one was different, and none of them matched. It was the most chaotic thing I'd seen all day. I loved it immediately. "Thanks," I said. "I don't think I need one just now." "You never know," she replied. "That's what the barrel's for." She pulled a button from her apron pocket and dropped it in. It clinked against the others in a way that suggested it had found old friends. She sat down on a stool that I'm fairly certain hadn't been there a moment ago and began knitting with needles the size of parsnips. I didn't ask what she was making. It didn't seem to matter. "You just visiting?" she asked. I nodded. "Drifting. Good village for that. We don't get in the way of much." That was true. The place seemed to have perfected the art of non-interference. I crouched beside the barrel and gently stirred the buttons with 1 finger. The sound was soft and oddly satisfying, like polite applause from a group of shy beetles. "Found any good ones?" she asked. I held one up. It was round and wooden, with a swirl pattern that looked like a snail had taken a walk and left a diary. "That one's seen things," she said with a knowing nod. I dropped it back in. The sky dimmed a little further. A few windows were glowing now, lit from within by candles or hearths, or just a general sense of welcome. "You staying the night?" she asked. I smiled faintly. I don't usually stay. The stone doesn't like to linger. She didn't ask what that meant. Instead, she said, "Well, if you do decide to sleep, don't do it near the geese. They're suspicious of dreams." "Good to know." I stood. She nodded once, then resumed her knitting with a look of intense concentration usually reserved for diffusing bombs or icing cakes. I left the button barrel behind. But I thought about it. I thought about it all the way back to the drying racks. They were still there. Still damp. Still drying. Some things take the time they take. As twilight settled softly over the village, I decided to make one last small loop around the far end. Just to see. Not to discover anything, of course. That wouldn't be the Clyde way. But to observe, to notice, to drift. Past the soup pot, the wool racks, and the nearly invisible chicken tracks. There was a small stone building with a slanted roof and a thin plume of smoke curling from a crooked chimney. The sign out front was a piece of slate hung by a frayed bit of rope. No words, just a faint carving of what might have been a loaf of bread, or a very optimistic potato. A bell chimed faintly as I pushed the door open. The smell inside was warm. That's the best word I can give it. Not just warm as in temperature, though it was certainly that, but warm in the way memories sometimes are. Slightly yeasty, a little floury, with a hint of something toasty at the edges. The baker was a round man with a calm face and the slow hands of someone who stopped counting hours. He didn't greet me with words, just a raised eyebrow and a gentle nod toward the small counter where 3 loaves rested. Each was a different shape, one round, one oblong, and one shaped rather confidently like a cat. I pointed to the cat-shaped one. "That's marmalade," the baker said. "Not flavored, just shaped. Long story." I nodded as though I already knew the story. He wrapped it in cloth and handed it over without asking for anything in return. I offered a quiet, "Thank you." He offered an even quieter, "You're welcome." There was a bench by the oven. I sat. The oven crackled faintly. Every now and then, something shifted inside. Logs adjusting, perhaps, or heat settling into the bricks. It was the sound of nothing baking, not emptiness, just a gentle pause. The baker moved slowly behind me, checking trays, turning dough, humming occasionally under his breath in a tune I couldn't quite place. Probably something old. Or invented. A little girl peeked in from the back doorway, holding a wooden spoon with a ribbon tied to it. She didn't speak, but gave me a very serious look, then disappeared again. I liked this place. After a while, I stood. The baker gave a small wave with flour-covered fingers. I waved back with my loaf of marmalade and stepped into the early night. The village had gone mostly quiet. A shutter creaked somewhere. A dog barked once as if to say, "That's enough now," and no one disagreed. I sat down on a low stone wall and unwrapped the bread. It was warm. I didn't eat it just yet. I just held it, letting the warmth reach my hands, the scent of not quite sweet dough settle into the moment. The stone in my pocket remained still. So I sat, and I watched. And I waited for the bread to tell me something. It didn't, but I listened anyway. It was later now, the sort of later that doesn't come with a precise time, just a shared understanding among villagers that it's time to close shutters, bank fires, and lower voices. I was back at the wool rack. Of course I was. A little girl, perhaps the same one with the spoon ribbon from earlier, perhaps not, stood nearby with her arms folded and a serious look on her face. She nodded once. "Looks dry." I nodded back. "Dry enough?" I agreed. She reached out and touched one of the hanks. It shifted slightly under her fingers, giving off that soft, fuzzy sound wool makes when it's ready to be made into something new. She seemed satisfied with the result and trotted off toward one of the cottages without another word. I stood there a little longer, just me and the wool and the quiet. The wind had calmed to a gentle murmur, rustling the rooftops like someone whispering goodnight in a library. The kind of hush that doesn't want to end a story, only pause it. The wool really did look dry now. Not completely, of course. Nothing in this village seemed to believe in absolutes, but dry enough to move on, dry enough to be combed, spun, and turned into something both softer and stronger. The stone in my pocket gave a familiar hum, software low, certain. I reached in and curled my fingers around it. It was warm again. Not hot, not urgent, just ready. I looked down at the stone and gave it a little nod. All right. The air shimmered slightly around the edges of the path. Not bright, not flashy, just a quiet shift, like a curtain being drawn or a chapter turning itself. I took one last look at the wool, at the crooked cottages, at the small stack of firewood beside the soup pot, at the cat-shaped loaf now tucked into the sling of my satchel. And then, with a step that felt like both goodbye and see you again, I let the stone guide me forward. The world blinked. The breeze vanished. The smells of peat and lanolin and bread slipped away, and I was back beneath the tree, the same old one, bark like driftwood, roots like memory. The stone in my palm glowed faintly, then dimmed, settling back into silence. I let out a breath and leaned against the trunk. Where to next? But the stone didn't answer. Not yet. It never did. It would tell me when it was ready. And I'd go. But for now, I had time. Time and a very oddly shaped loaf of bread. I sat, and I waited. And I smiled. Because wool, like stories and time travelers, dries best when you don't rush it. I don't remember deciding to walk again. My legs seemed to make that choice before the rest of me caught up. The village hadn't gone anywhere, which was a comfort. Neither had the wool, or the soup pot, or the child-sized wooden spoon someone had now stuck into a flower pot as if to remind the plants who was in charge. The sky had reached that part of evening where it could no longer pretend to be late afternoon. Candles flickered in more windows now, and the paths glowed softly with the light of hearths I couldn't see but could somehow feel. I passed the button barrel again. The elderly woman was gone, but her knitting needles rested on the rim of a flower basket beside her stool, as if they might resume without her at any moment. Near the corner where the two river signs disagreed, I noticed something hanging on a crooked wooden peg. Mittens, a pair of them, but not quite. One was a faded rust red with a loop of green yarn at the wrist. The other was brownish with the ghost of a blue stripe running down one side like it had once meant to be part of a pattern but forgot. I looked around. No one seemed to be watching. No one ever seemed to be watching in this village, which was somehow more reassuring than eerie. A note sat beneath the peg. It read, "If the wind nips, borrow these. If you find the mates, bring them back." So I borrowed them. They were warm, not perfectly fitting. My fingers didn't quite align with the places the original owner had intended, but warm in that way that speaks more to the care put into the knitting than the precision of the sizing. I walked slowly past the stone bridge again, the one that barely earned the title but wore it proudly. Beneath it, the same little stream still whispered over rocks and old leaves. Someone had tied a bit of string between two sticks near the bank. Maybe for fishing, maybe for measuring patience. I liked that. Just past the bridge, near the edge of the village where the trees began to lean in closer, a small stack of stones marked a path I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't really a trail, more of a suggestion. I took it. It led nowhere in particular. Just a low clearing with moss and a single tree with bark like melted wax. Someone had tied scraps of fabric to the branches, little bits of blue and green and cream-colored cloth, fluttering quietly in the evening air. I didn't ask why. I just stood. A thread loosened on one of the mittens. I tucked it gently back into the stitchwork, and I stayed until the first stars began to flicker, barely visible between the limbs. By the time I made it back to the main path, the village had mostly disappeared into shadow. A rooster made a soft hiccup of a sound like it had forgotten what time it was. A cow shifted its weight in a nearby shed. I could hear the flutter of feathers. Nothing urgent, just night sounds remembering how to be themselves. The wool was still there, though it no longer mattered whether it was wet or dry. That wasn't the point anymore. I stopped near the bench made from the wagon wheel and rested my hand on the wood. The stone in my pocket pulsed. Not insistently, just enough. Time again. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because in a place like this, I knew the village would remember me. Just a little. Just enough. Back at the tree, that old familiar one, I let the stone glow fully. It felt right, and as the world shifted gently once more and the breeze fell silent, I closed my eyes and let the hum carry me forward.